Hi there, knitters. Welcome to episode 59 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. Okay, let's jump into today's topic. We are going to be looking at average body lengths and heights compared to average garment lengths and heights, but not from a perspective that you may think. In episode 13 of this podcast, I created a visual representation of standard or average garment lengths and how it may relate to the average body height. So if you wear a cropped sweater, it may fall to your waist. If you wear a standard length garment, it may fall to, say, the top of your pockets on your pair of jeans or something. That's not the detail I want to talk about today. Today, I want to talk about garment length and how we design them and how that can relate to your unique body no matter what your height is. And this actually wasn't a write-in request, as so many of these conversations are. This was an email exchange between me and one of my clients' customers who wrote in asking about how to add length to their garment. So because it's a client, I can't really divulge too much information about the person or persons involved, but I can talk to you a little bit about the details in the email because they're pretty generic. So the exchange went a little bit like this. We received an email that said, "I'm knitting such and such a sweater. I am 5'9" tall, 5'9" tall. How tall is the designer?" And I wrote back and I said, the designer is wearing the garment on a 5'5" tall body. To which the customer wrote back and said, "Perfect, that's 4 inches difference. I'm going to add 4 inches to my garment." Which is what started this whole train of thought about how we approach adding length to garments based on our body size. So body length, height, not necessarily circumference in this case, but more length or height. So before I tell you what the end of that conversation looked like, let's just talk a little bit about average adult sizes that have become standardized across the garment industry and how you can use that to your advantage when you're comparing it to your body lengths. So in the US, average adult body heights don't vary that greatly. The average adult is somewhere between 65.5 and 70 inches tall, and that's across all genders. Of course, there are people that are much taller and people that are much shorter, but because no single garment can be customized for every single person on the rack, averages are created and we build based on those averages. So there are a couple of measurements that are going to be really useful in the conversation I want to have with you. So we're going to start from the bottom and work up a little bit. So of those 2 adult height ranges that I just provided to you, 65.5 up to 70 inches, the floor to waist height, so the difference between your proper waist, so usually the narrowest part of your waist, and the floor you're standing on, is somewhere between 40.5 inches and 42.5 inches. And again, this is across all genders. The average floor to cervical height, now the cervical is, if you feel on the back of your neck, that big bump at the base of your neck is what we call the cervical or the cervical. There's an E on the end of it, and I'm not sure how to pronounce it properly. But in the terms of where we're measuring on our body, it's roughly in line with this base of your neck right before it becomes shoulder. So that height, that cervical, someone please tell me phonetically how to say that, to the floor height average is somewhere between 56.25 inches and 60 inches. So those 2 measurements don't really tell you much about the length of your body, but you can extrapolate that. So if we know that the average shoulder to floor height is one measurement and the average floor to waist measurement is another measurement, we can deduce the difference between those two measurements and extrapolate that the difference between our true waist and our top of shoulder is somewhere between 15 3/4 inches and 17 1/2 inches, which is probably going to sound really short to a lot of people because we don't often see garments knit that short. That's okay. That is simply our, the American average body lengths. That doesn't include any length to go past the waist, which is why we often see garments knit longer. We very rarely see them that short, although some can be. All of that is to say that even though the average heights across the body spectrum for adults is around 4.5 inches, from 65.5 up to 70 inches, the difference in our body length is only about 2.5 inches. So that means that if someone is 4 inches taller than you, that 4 inches can be distributed over a really wide part of your body. Doesn't sound the right way to say it, but it's not necessarily all in the legs or all in the body. And I think that's where that knitter was getting stuck. They said, okay, the model is 5 feet 5 inches. I am 5 feet 9 inches. That's 4 inches different, so I need to knit my garment 4 inches longer. What that means though is the assumption that was being made in that case is that vertical difference in height of 4 inches was from the waist up. The assumption being made was that the legs were exactly the same length. Now, is it possible? Absolutely, that is entirely possible. Is it likely? Not really, based on sort of our averages across the country. So, I thought it would be fun to share some kind of real world examples with you. I always find them more relatable when I see them put into practice when I'm trying to explain a concept. So here are two real world examples of differences in bodies where heights and lengths don't always add up. So here is me with my dear friend Tammy. This was at Rhinebeck just this year, as a matter of fact. You can see Tammy and I are the exact same height. We are both 5'3" tall. We wear the same shoe size even, which is really convenient because she gets to model my socks for me when I design them. But all that to say is when Tammy and I stand side by side, we are the same height. We get confused as sisters very often. But what's really interesting is when I sit down at a table across from Tammy, if we are in the same chairs, I look over her head. I'm significantly taller in the body than she is. When I have sat down at her loom to try weaving, my feet barely reached the pedals, and yet she was touching them without trouble. She'd set it for her own height, which just shows me that there is at least 2 or 3 inches difference between her leg length and my body length, even though our overall height is the same. Equal height does not necessarily mean equal body measurements. On the flip side of this, here is me and my friend Heather. Now, I think I've shown this picture on this podcast before. I always find it so amusing because Heather is 5'11" tall. I am 5'3" tall. So if you're doing that math, there is 8 inches between us in our total overall height. What's really interesting though is my inseam is 27 inches. Heather's is 34 inches. So if you're doing that math again, that means Heather's inner leg length is 7 inches longer than mine, which you say, okay, she's 8 inches taller. That kind of makes sense. But that means that our difference from our waist to our top of body is only 1 inch. So when I put on this lovely sweater that I knit for Heather earlier this year, it sits around my high hip elevation. When Heather puts it on, it's not much different. I mean, yes, it is slightly, it's a 1 inch difference, but it's not as an extreme a difference as you might think, given our overall total difference in height. So that's why measuring your own body or having someone help you measure your body can be so important in understanding how a average developed garment will fit your unique body. So one of the first things I think that we can do to make ourselves more educated about a garment that we want to knit is to look at how the garment falls on the designer and how you therefore want it to fall on you. Since it's pretty unlikely that you would be able to email a designer and have them tell you their waist to high point shoulder measurement, you have to visually look at their body in the garment and kind of extrapolate that information and relate it to your own body. So if you look at a designer, I guess I should back up and say you can generally see a full shot of a garment on a designer in one photo at some point or other. I know there's always artistic photos of a detail shot, whether it's the cuff or, a stitch pattern, but usually there's at least one half body shot so you can see the garment from their neck all the way to their knees, okay? So what you want to look at first and foremost is where does that garment hit on the designer? If they're wearing jeans, there's always a great example of seeing where it relates to the pockets or the grommets on the side of the pockets. If they are wearing a cropped sweater, is it at the top of their jeans? Is it well above the top of the jeans, etc.? I'm assuming everybody wears jeans in photos. Of course, that's not accurate, but you can use other parts of their body to see where the garment falls. And you don't necessarily have to know what that measurement is on them, because you have your own body that you can use to make that same relative measurement relative to. That's a weird way to say that. But all that to say is if a garment is provided to a specific length on a designer, and you know what that specific length looks like on you, you can then make modifications simply based on the visual. So if you're a knitter who is really interested in knitting a lot of garments in the future, my recommendation would be to take some time, perhaps over the holiday season, and make yourself a little bit of a go-to body garment catalog. That sounds a little bit strange, but we are so used to purchasing, or I suppose making, if you're a sewist, garments based on these average bodies that we develop from. More often than not, we will have a garment or hopefully multiple garments in our wardrobe already that we really love. Maybe you've got a crop top that just hits you in exactly the right spot for where you feel comfortable. Maybe you are someone who loves tunics and you've got a favorite tunic. Take those garments out of your wardrobe, lay them flat, and measure the garment from the high point shoulder. Now, on your shirt, it's not going to be here, obviously, but it's generally where that top seam meets the bottom of the collar. And measure it straight down the back of the garment to the bottom of the hem. And you can do this for multiple garments. Do it for cropped sweaters or t-shirts if you wear them. Do them for tunic length. Do them for the standard length that just barely hits the top of your jeans. Just categorize them in a way that will make sense to you relative to the garments that you want to knit. And if you have, again, I'll just go back to cropped because they're very popular right now. If you measure a cropped garment from your wardrobe that you love, and the total garment length is, let's say, 20 inches from that high point shoulder to the bottom hem, and the designer's pattern for your size is also the same length, perfect. You don't have to make any modifications. But that's rarely the case. I would say many of us make modifications to one part of a garment or another. Now, if you measure your garment and it's 20 inches and the designer's pattern for your size is 18 inches, you know you're going to want to add 2 inches to the length of the garment that you're going to knit so that it hits you at the right point. So whether you are 4 inches taller than the designer or 3 inches shorter than the designer, you still know what that length needs to be relative to your body. Let's talk a little bit about garment schematics that are in patterns and how you can use that to help you make these educated decisions. When it comes to finding information about the finished dimensions of a garment, you can generally find it on the schematic included with most garment patterns. Some of the dimensions that I'm going to talk to you about in the following examples will not be available in every schematic. Just not all schematics are created equal. You do have the option of reaching out to the designer to see if they will provide you with specific information that is missing from the schematic, but you can't always guarantee that you'll get a response. So I want to empower you to know what information to look for in a schematic so that you can use it to help you build a garment that's going to fit you the way you want it to. I've largely been talking about total garment length. We know from those of us who have made garments before that there are 2 lengths that are largely critical. One is the yoke depth, which is simply the length from the top of your shoulders to any separation for the underarms. And then the body length, which is from the underarm to the bottom hem. And both of those measurements are really critical in how the garment will fit your body. What's not necessarily always included in schematics is the total garment length. That's the measurement I was just referring to when you want to measure your garments. You want to measure all the way from the highest point shoulder, or the HPS, all the way down to the bottom of the garment. So let's take a look at some examples of schematics and what information you can use to help you get that full garment length if it's not provided on the schematic in the pattern. So, as I admitted 2 weeks ago in my last video, a drop shoulder is my favorite type of garment to not only knit but wear, and I wanted to start there simply because it has the least amount of complex or hard to find information in it. I hope that's the right way to say that. Essentially, a drop shoulder is a square all the way up. Whether you knit the body in the round or flat, it's going to be one width all the way up from the hem to the shoulders. So a schematic may have information on it such as the underarm to hem body length, the armhole depth, and may also include any shoulder shaping depth. The shoulder shaping is simply any short rows that are added above the armhole to account for the slope in our shoulders from the top of our shoulder to our high point shoulder. There's often a slope differential of around an inch there. It can be as high as 2 inches or as little as half an inch. They're just all uniquenesses to our own bodies. All that to say, to find the total back length for a drop shoulder sweater, it's fairly easy. You're going to simply add up the length of the underarm to hem, the armhole depth, and the shoulder drop or the short rows. So let's just use size 1 as the example for this one. We're going to add up the 12.5 inches of the body length from the underarm to the hem, to our 5.5 inch armhole depth and our 1.5 inches of shoulder drop or short row shaping. All said and done, that tells me that the total garment length at the back neck is 19.5 inches. If you are someone who likes your sweaters to be 20 inches long, you would need to add half an inch to the body. If you are someone who likes your total garment length to be 18 inches, you'll knit the body 1.5 inches shorter. So you're adding the length to the body below the armholes for a drop shoulder. Actually, pretty much for most garments. You're going to be adding or subtracting that length from the body below the armholes. So what if you have a schematic that doesn't lay all of that out for you in a pretty little package? Not all schematics include all of those details. Very often a schematic will at least include the side body length. They will also include the upper arm circumference. In a drop shoulder style garment, the relationship between the upper arm or upper sleeve circumference is directly proportional to the depth of the armhole edge. Because you are simply picking up stitches around the edge of an armhole, the number of stitches you pick up is exactly the number of stitches that relates to in the armhole circumference, which means the armhole depth is half of the height of the armhole circumference. That all makes sense in my head, but putting it into words can sometimes be tricky. So, looking at the example here, we've got an 11-inch upper sleeve circumference. Because the armhole depth will be half of that upper sleeve circumference, you can say, okay, my armhole depth is now 5.5 inches, and you don't even have to have that information on the schematic. Okay, so now we've figured out what the armhole depth is, but what about the shoulder drop that I talked about? So if the shoulder drop or the short row depth is not included on the schematic, you get to do a little bit of math. And if you've been here for a while, you know I love math. So just to walk through that one more time with you, if you have not watched one of these videos before, what we're going to do is go into the pattern and physically add up the total number of short rows that we have in the pattern and convert that to a vertical length using our row gauge. So for the purpose of this example, we'll say that the pattern calls for 8 short rows and our row gauge is 22 rows equals 4 inches or 10 centimeters. To convert that into a vertical height, we're simply going to divide the total number of rows, which is 8, by our row gauge, which is 22, and we get a result of 0.36. If you're working in US units, you'll multiply that 0.36 by 4 because we measure our row gauge over 4 inches, and we get a result of 1.45 inches, which we would round to 1.5 inches. If you're working in metric, you're going to take that same result of 0.36 and multiply it by 10, or if you want to be really accurate, 10.15, and you get a result around 3.6 or 3.65 centimeters. So now we have just extrapolated the armhole depth by dividing our total upper sleeve circumference by half, and we have extrapolated the total depth of our short rows using the number of rows in the pattern and our pattern row gauge. So although the information wasn't right there on the schematic, it is in the pattern so you can find it for yourself. Similar to a drop shoulder style garment, you can use similar measurements from within your set-in sleeve style garment to find your total back length. If your schematic provides it and you've got your side length, or your body length, I guess I should say, from underarm to hem, your armhole depth, and your shoulder drop, you can simply add those 3 numbers up and figure out the total back length. Unlike a drop shoulder garment, the upper sleeve circumference on a set-in sleeve style garment does not directly correlate to the depth of the armhole in the same way. Instead, if that information for the armhole depth is not available in the schematic, I can't imagine a case where it isn't, but if for some reason it's not there, you're going to want to dive into your pattern and look for a target length to knit to. Whether you're knitting your set-in sleeve armhole top down or bottom up, you're inevitably going to have a section of instructions that tells you to knit to a target length. That will, in probably 9 out of 10 cases, be the target armhole depth that you're working towards, and that will fill in the gap on your schematic. If the shoulder drop or the short rows are not included, you can figure out the same vertical depth as we did in the drop shoulder garment by dividing the total number of short rows by the row gauge of the pattern and multiply it out in your 4 inches if you're working in US units or 10 centimeters if you're working in metric. So overall, it is quite similar to finding information as you have on the drop shoulder. Just make sure you don't apply the same approach of the upper sleeve circumference relating to the yoke depth on the set-in sleeve style. I would hate for you to get caught in that trap. Okay, and finally we are going to talk about raglan style and circular yoke style garment construction or extrapolation of information. There we go. So these two get lumped together because the construction of them is so very similar in terms of number of rows and how that relates to yoke depth. Now, in an ideal world, in your schematic, you will have the side length or the underarm to hem length, just like you did on the drop shoulder and the set-in sleeve style example. But what can often get omitted is the yoke depth. I wouldn't say there's necessarily a particular reason why that information is omitted, but I would say it's more common on patterns where there is perhaps a really complex stitch pattern where you simply have to work a specific number of repeats to make it work, or if you've got a color work chart where all of the shaping is incorporated into the actual yoke depth. In those cases, because you're not necessarily just working stockinette stitch to a target length, you won't necessarily find that information on the pattern. So, if you've got an example like we've got up right now, to find the total back length, we are going to do something very similar to what we've done in the previous examples. We are going to add the body length from the underarm to the hem to our yoke depth, but you'll notice that this yoke depth is at the center front. To find our back length, we're going to have to do similar math to what we've been doing for the short rows in the previous examples. You'll need to go into the pattern, find the total number of short rows that you work to shape the back neck, and add that length to your existing length of the yoke depth and the body length. If your pattern does not have the yoke depth included, you can still find the information without having to email the designer. I'm not saying you can't email the designer. I'm just saying if you can find it yourself, it may help you get unstuck. It is slightly more tedious, but the information is there if you know what to look for. So what you will need to do to figure out your total yoke depth is to count up the number of rows worked in the yoke for your size. So if you add up all of let's say it's a 4-row repeat, just pulling something out of my head. Let's say you've got a 4-row stitch pattern repeat, and for your size, you have to work it 10 times. So you've got a 40-row yoke depth. You'll apply the same math that we used in the short rows to figure out that total front center depth. So if we've got 40 rows and our row gauge is still the 22 rows over 4 inches or 10 centimeters, we are going to divide those 40 rows by 22 and we get a result of 1.8. For the US units, you'll multiply that 1.8 by 4 and you'll get 7.25 inches. If you're working in metric, you will multiply that 1.8 by your 10 or 10.15 and you get 18.2 centimeters or 18.4 centimeters, somewhere in that range. So, pardon me for my on-the-fly metric conversions, but essentially the information is there. So you've now figured out the center front yoke depth, and your last step is to do the short row shaping. Everything that we've already talked about for the short rows on any of these examples. You'll count out the total number of short rows that the designer has you work and extrapolate it into a target length using the project's row gauge. Okay, well that devolved into a whole lot of math, didn't it? I want to thank you guys all so much for being here, not only today, but over the last 2 years. With the way that the scheduling works out, releasing a video every 2 weeks, this will actually be my final video for 2024. If I was to release one in 2 weeks, it would be on Christmas Day, which I will be celebrating with my family up in Canada. So I'm going to give myself a slightly extended Christmas holiday and take some time off until the new year. However, in the new year, we have got some fun videos coming up. As I mentioned at the end of our last video, we're going to be having some discussions about modifying raglans and circular yoke style sweaters for broader shoulders. Those were some specific requests we had. But we're also going to be looking at some different collar options for top-down circular sweaters, understanding collar sizes and how it relates to your body. And I've also had a request for more information about magic loop socks worked from the toe up. So the beginning of 2025 is already promising to be full of lots of new information and more math, because who doesn't love math? But truly, at the risk of sounding redundant, thank you so much for continuing to be here and taking me along with you on your knitting journey. It has been my honor to spend time sharing my knowledge with you, and I love seeing those light bulb moments when people write in and are just like, oh my gosh, I got it. And I love that. So thank you very much. However you celebrate your holidays, please know that I am sending you and your friends and family my best wishes, and I truly look forward to seeing you again in 2025. So all the best, happy knitting, happy new year, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon.